Why is it so hard to be honest about workplace bias? At an interpersonal level, there are two forms of bias, the most prevalent of which is what I describe as directional bias. That is, it is aimed mostly unconsciously towards you because of your ethnicity, race, gender, disability, sexual orientation, socioeconomic background, age, family makeup, and so on. But there is also reverse bias. That is when we misinterpret unfavourable decisions and behaviours towards us as driven by unconscious or implicit bias. If someone at work asks me where I'm from, I could perceive that comment as an exclusionary microaggression. And I guess that would be a simple form of directional bias. But what if they were just interested in where I came from? After all, I am a minority in the midst of the majority. Then that person could simply be genuinely interested in where I'm from. What's the matter with that? If my response to them was one of annoyance, withdrawn, or passive-aggressive, that would be my reverse microaggression. But nobody ever openly mentions or talks about that. Reverse bias is not as prevalent as directional bias, but nonetheless it is prevalent. And it's extremely damaging to minorities and marginalized groups in the workplace because it has a self-perpetuating impact on directional bias and its associated career stifling problems. When most minorities or marginalized groups sense bias correctly or incorrectly, they don't call it out. What they do is look for somebody like them, same sex, same color, same physical ability, same sexual orientation, and tell them instead, which reinforces the bias about the majority. Likewise, when a member of the majority senses reverse bias, they don't call it out either. What they do is look for somebody who looks like them and tell them, which reinforces the bias about minorities and marginalized groups having chips on their shoulders, amongst other things. And never the twain shall meet. Why can't we be honest about the existence of both directional and reverse bias? Most organizations are being misled by well-meaning but fundamentally flawed, celebrated activists, consultants, academics, and behavioral scientists that conflate wider social injustice resolution models out there with day-to-day solutions for workplace bias issues in here being the workplace. The problem with the out there resolution model is that it starts and ends with leaders in authority having to change things in isolation or unilaterally. If a minority or member of a marginalized group is a victim of aggravated assault or physical attack as a result of their difference out there in the wider world, they are limited to what they can do. Their only recourse is the authorities, changes in laws or legal redress. However, in the workplace, this type of bias is highly unlikely, which means there is far greater scope for a more collaborative, interpersonal solution. And guess what? It's led by the traditional victim. When you address workplace bias issues from a place of guilt as a leader or pain as a minority or marginalized group member, it actually impairs your vision and you come up with the wrong answers. However, if you address workplace bias issues from a place of fairness, you can see clearly now that the pain and guilt have gone. Okay, I remixed the original song a little, but you get the picture. A case in point is the concept of white fragility. The idea that the majority become defensive when confronted with the reality of racial inequality. Well, anyone becomes defensive and fragile when you confront them with ideas that go against their values, whether that intimation is correct or incorrect. So, if you were to say to me, or people that look like me, that we had a chip on our shoulder, and I got defensive and emotionally fragile about that accusation, what would you call that? Black fragility? Or if you said the same to a woman and she reacted defensively and emotionally, would that be female fragility? Is there a heterosexual fragility, a disability fragility, a minority sexual preference fragility, an age fragility? Hopefully the penny's dropping. There is no such thing as white fragility. This reaction that we attribute to the majority is a universal response common to everyone, regardless of ethnicity, race, physical ability, gender, sexual orientation, and so on. and is what I describe as defensive fragility. That is the propensity for everyone to get their back up when indirectly or directly accused of anything that paints them in a negative light. Furthermore, defensive fragility on an individual and corporate level is the number one obstacle to navigating workplace bias. If you could understand and appreciate defensive fragility as an obstacle, then you can adopt, develop, and build strategies and techniques to harmoniously transcend and overcome it, which will enable you to effortlessly navigate actual or perceived bias if and when you're confronted by it. But of course, you can't see this, let alone accept or say this, if you're coming from a place of guilt or pain. We've already established that there are two forms of bias. So how can you possibly expect to mitigate the career-stifling impact of workplace bias without accepting its multidirectional nature? So me as a minority recognizing both directional and reverse bias doesn't make me a sellout. You as a leader and/or a member of the majority recognizing both reverse and directional bias doesn't make you a bigot either. It actually allows us both to have clarity on the problem so we can dissipate it as an issue over time and resolve it. Stop spending inordinate amounts of time trying to eradicate bias and instead equip people with skills to navigate it. I like to use the analogy of sailing. It's a tough sport, and to get to your destination, there are certain constants that could stop you from reaching that goal. For example, strong winds, rough waves, rain, snow. But people still reach their destination. How? They navigate these constants. And it's the same with bias. We can navigate it if we learn how to, just like a sailor navigates the elements. My challenge to leaders is to accept the multidirectional nature of workplace bias at an interpersonal level and equip and empower all staff with the skills to navigate it so that we can dissipate career-stifling and conflict-generating bias over time.